by interested investors. In China, the large banks issue bonds to each other and use the money raised to support their own phalanx of corporate customers. It is simply another means of force-feeding capital through the system to maximize short-term economic activity. The various means of capital perfusion have become so many and so lax that the government actually lost control of its own financial network. The government knew it had to somehow rein in credit, but it wanted to find a way of doing so that wouldn't actually cause a recession, much less an economic crash and the unemployment that would go along with it. The government dared not risk changing the fundamental method of handing out credit, nor the large-scale absence of quality checks, nor the absence of due diligence. The solution was to issue a centrally imposed quota on bank lending every month. In most months, the quota was reached well before month's end, causing the entire financial sector to seize up when the credit suddenly dried up. This led to two outcomes. First, the central bank had to repeatedly pump in emergency credit the day after the quota was reached, or else face the sort of systemic financial crash that US subprime caused in late 2007. Second, banks, firms, and retail investors, appalled by the idea that the government might actually deny them credit because of something as silly as a lending quota, built their own financial network to run in parallel to the existing system. This shadow system includes everything from loan sharking to financial products with even fewer quality controls than official bank lending. After all, they were formed expressly to bypass government authority. By the first quarter of 2013, China's own central bank estimated that such shadow lending was exceeding all other forms of credit combined. That puts total financing at around $5 trillion for an economy only worth about $8 trillion. Not only is that an absolute volume of capital more than 7 times new lending in the United States, it is the equivalent of an Obama stimulus package, that's $800 billion over 2 years, about every 29 days. Just as the United States meted out access to its market to bribe its way into the world's largest ever alliance, the Chinese used finance to bribe both its often conflicting regions and ever-restive populations into quiescence and even cooperation. It is a brilliant strategy, but it has limits. Japan followed a similar system in the 1950s through the 1980s, eventually reaching a level of overextension that brought the entire system to its knees. In the quarter century since the Japanese crash, the Japanese banking sector has retreated completely from the global system, and the Japanese economy as a whole has not grown. Such stagnation is China's best-case scenario future. Unfortunately, it is also not a very likely one. The Japanese economy is largely domestically held and demand-driven, so while loose credit certainly helps, it is not the hedge against doomsday that it is in China. Additionally, Japan is over 98% ethnically Japanese, and over 4/5 of the population lives on the island of Honshu. China is considerably less unified regionally, ethnically, and spatially. The United States even experimented with this system. The idea that growth and throughput were more important than profitability and a positive rate of return on capital. The result was a mess of graft, abuse, and unwise lending that created the failed company we knew as Enron, and the property bubble we now know as subprime. Both experiments created impressive growth for years, but such investments were geared to maximize throughput, not profits or efficiency. And so they collapsed. In essence, the entire Chinese system is subprime in every economic sector. Problem 2. Demography. But let's assume for a minute that China's remarkably unstable financial system holds together a bit longer. Something even worse is just around the corner. China's one-child policy is often held up as the pinnacle of what can happen when a government is willing to pair demographic concerns with a complete disregard for individual rights. In a few short years, strict enforcement slashed the birth rate, preventing an estimated 200 million to 400 million births and heading off the overpopulation problem that policymakers so feared. Now, the success of that policy means the end of the Chinese system. There are many legitimate criticisms of one child. Forced abortions, the ability to buy government approval to flaunt the policy, the concept that the government can choose who can reproduce when, a massive sex imbalance in a culture that prefers sons to daughters. All these and more have twisted Chinese culture in awkward and painful directions. But the real problem with one child is that it worked. During the period from 1979 to 2003, when it was strictly enforced, the birth rate dropped by half. That slashed everything from healthcare to education to food costs, but it gutted the most recent generation. After 3 decades of the policy, there has been a European-style hollowing out of the younger segments of the population. This presents China with 3 unavoidable and system-killing problems. First, China is aging far more quickly than it is getting rich. At the beginning of China's international resurgence in 1990, the average Chinese citizen was only 24.9 years old, and the country boasted some 350 million citizens aged 15 to 29. It was this simple circumstance that allowed for China's massive manufacturing boom in the 1990s and 2000s. China was the world's ultimate source of cheap labor, and no other developing country could compete with the Chinese on price. Fast forward to the present, and courtesy of one child, the average Chinese is now 37, just a shade younger than Americans who are currently 37.3 years old. The Chinese will pass the Americans in average age in 2019, and by 2030 will be 42.9 years old versus 39.6 for the Americans. The Chinese call it the 4-2-1 problem. 4 grandparents to 2 parents to 1 child. China is not yet wealthy enough to be able to try to afford a pension system like the advanced democracies, which places the onus of caring for the elderly on their descendants, of whom there are precious few. In terms of relative numbers, the financial cost of the one-child policy is more than double the comparative costs that the Americans face from the boomer retirement. And the Americans already have a social security system in place to absorb some of the cost. The burden of having to financially support their elderly has a catastrophic impact on young workers' professional and financial development, reducing educational opportunities, gutting consumption, and all but making savings impossible. In China's specific situation, not only will this factor alone freeze in place China's efforts to switch its economy from exports to internal consumption and stymie its efforts to move up the value-added scale, but it will also prevent the sort of savings that makes the force-fed finance model possible in the first place. Second, China will never be able to move away from its current export-driven model. Recall what roles each age group carries out in society from an economic point of view. Young workers do the consuming that generates economic growth. The last baby boom that China experienced was in the 1980s, just as one child